All right, to begin with, let me give just a quick a little bit of background. This is my third year with BYU-Idaho. I teach B499A, which is the capstone business class. And I've also taught B380, which is international business. I'm a TJL and OCR. I was an adjunct professor for another university for about 5 years. And my full-time job, I work for Intel Corporation doing strategic planning. I've been doing that for 18 years. And that involves mostly capacity planning, so facilities and supply chain kind of stuff. Building about 3 million computer chips a day. So that's what I do most of the time. I also co-founded, I operate a sports publishing business. I've been doing that for 13 years. Got my MBA from BYU in '97. I'm a big family history junkie. I spend ridiculous amounts of time on that now when I have it. And in fact, I'm a little distracted. I just got some stuff in my email a few minutes ago from Janice Perry, who's a relative, and stuff I've been looking for years. So pretty excited to be I'm heading down to Pro tomorrow to see all this stuff firsthand. So live in Queen Creek, Arizona. My wife Lisa, we have 5 kids, ranging from age 17 down to age 3. So I'm going to be raising kids till I'm really old. Anyway, teaching through stories. We start with a question. What comes to mind when you think of stories, telling stories?
Telling stories is to come in ways. One's like a fable, and one's like a history. But you're trying to pull somebody into something you've experienced or enjoyed through storytelling. You're verbally expressing what you've experienced or what you care about.
Yeah, very good. Okay.
Stories is a way that we connect and interconnect with each other, and it's how we make those meaningful moments in our lives.
Yeah, very good. The back and then here in the front. Yes. You, yes.
Sorry.
Sorry.
Well, I'm a humanities teacher, and so when I think about stories, I think about that art form that's been around forever, because that's how things like, the Billy and the Pussy got started, or they started out as stories.
Yeah. Excellent example. We'll talk a little bit about that too. Stories exist as long as people have existed. And here in the front.
I think stories are good at reinforcing principles. They help people remember, what point that you're trying to make.
Yeah. In fact, that's a great segue into what I'm going to start with. But one more comment here.
It's completely kind of the opposite, but I automatically think of the church app, because I work with the youth, and I put it in and write the story in your family history, your family search, and so we're pushing that to tell their story over and over. And so get your app ready, put the story in what happened. So I think of that.
Really good point. Yeah, in fact, that's changed family history for me. It's something I was interested in. I started learning stories that became some obsessions. So anyway, my experience with stories was really this. I always liked stories. I used to watch General Conference as a kid because my parents would make me and give me little tests afterward to make sure I was paying attention. And I always looked forward to President Monson speaking at the time I was little, because he always told stories, and I knew I could always hear some great story from him. So whenever he spoke, I was glued to the TV and listening to see what story he was going to tell. And as I went through school, teachers who told stories always kept my attention. So when I started teaching, I started using stories because that's what I liked. But that was really the extent of it. And then as I started working for Intel, years ago, they started having me teach manufacturing theory class. I travel around the world and I talk about how do we improve manufacturing theories. It doesn't sound like the most interesting thing in the world. And we spent an entire week, 5 straight days, all day, teaching people. And one thing I do, the very first thing I teach as part of that class, I share a story that I had when I worked for the State Department. I had what I thought was my dream job. Anybody ever get their dream job coming out of school? You can pick any job in the world and you got it. And that's what I got. And I went, it was the worst job. It took me about 2 days to figure out it was the opposite of my dream job. And it was terrible. And I shared this story, and if I had time, I would share it today. You wouldn't believe it's true. It was. But people, 8 years later, I run into people in different countries and they say, hey, you're the guy who told that story about the State Department, aren't you? Yeah, actually I am. It's the only thing they remember probably from that whole week. But they remember that story. And I realized it's an effective way to teach people things that they can remember. I taught seminary many years ago in Idaho, in fact. And 20 years later, I'll run into some of my old students and they remember stories I told. They don't remember much else, but they remember what I told in terms of stories. So this kind of reinforced my feeling that what I taught that way could be remembered. And an example, In fact, given the time, I'm going to skip over the example, but it's just another story. So, purposes of stories. You'll get some stories here nonetheless. Stories can be used to inform. So if there's some sort of information you need to transmit to people, a story is a great way to do that. But it can be more than just sharing information. You can also teach people principles. You can teach them things they need to understand that they can then apply in their own lives. And maybe the most powerful form of storytelling can be used to motivate people. And there are times where you come in and you can teach something, you can explain something, they understand, but if they're not going to be motivated to go out and apply that and use it, how much have you really accomplished? And story is a really effective way to motivate people to action. So why? Why do stories work so well? I guess the first thing is stories are simple. You don't have to spend a lot of time coming up with a really complex teaching methodology in order to share stories. I was down there listening to Brother Broadhead talk about all of these teaching models. I thought, boy, compared to what I'm going to teach, this is kind of rocket science, and mine is very, very simple. But it can still be highly effective. Stories are timeless. Think back to stories that, as was shared, some of the oldest stories that have ever been written are still taught and still read and still understood and still effective. And it doesn't matter when they're shared. And stories can appeal to anybody. It doesn't matter the age, the race, the gender. A timeless story, an effective story can touch anybody. Stories are fun. At least good stories are fun. If it's a long, boring story and you have to sit through it, it may not be so much fun, but that's one of the reasons people tend to remember them. Stories are actually, this goes back to a study. There was a book that I read. Look, man. There was a book that I read about this that kind of got me into this whole why we teach the stories, and they were looking in the business world. There were some companies that were trying to train their employees, and it was a tech company like I work in, and what we do is we have a bunch of engineers who get in rooms and we just dump piles of data on people, and they're expected to understand that and analyze it and remember it. And Dan works in Intel with me, so he knows how this works. And then sometimes we make policy statements, and this is how, Dan works in legal, so they probably do a lot of this. So here are a bunch of policy statements. This is how we're going to do things. These are procedures we're going to use in the factory, and here's a bunch of data. And people walk out of these meetings sometimes clueless as to what they were supposed to take away. And so this other company started trying to use stories to teach these same things, and found that people actually remembered the stories, and then they combined the stories with data. But they combined the stories with policy statements and found it wasn't as effective. If they just used stories, it worked the best. And there's a book called, well, I'll show you the book here at the end that actually includes this example, which is fascinating. People remember stories. We've talked about that. Stories are also much more likely to motivate people to action. And again, this was something we found in our company when I go out and teach around the world to cause people to change the way they go about operating a factory and how they do their jobs. It's amazing how sharing stories of how this would work will stick with them, and then they'll think back to that and they'll reflect on that and actually implement it in their jobs. And then finally, stories pass on lessons from generation to generation. Think back to the stories you know about your ancestors and your own family. How many of these were passed on from grandparents and great-grandparents, and you then pass those along to your own children, and that's essentially what the family history session has become, is passing on these lessons, not just stories, but the lessons contained in those stories to my children, and hopefully they'll pass those along as well. So there is some science behind this, and as I mentioned, there are a few different books. In fact, there's a big buzz out there in the business world right now about teaching with stories, and there are all these people going around talking with companies as consultants and teaching how this can work. And I selected 5 of them that I'll share with you. But a lot of this came out of some of these books. So it really goes back to some pretty simple history. Spoken word comes before written language. And in any society, if you go back and look when it started, there was always a spoken word before there was written language.
So with this in mind, when you share stories online, do you voice them?
Yeah, we'll go into methods here on the next slide.
Okay.
Yeah, good question. And there are different ways to do that. But yeah, written stories on an online class is probably one of the least preferred methods to share this information. Something I had to learn the hard way. Some societies never actually developed a written language. They still were able to establish some pretty impressive civilizations. The Incas are a good example of that. They had a written language, but they had a spoken language, and they were able to still operate in a society and accomplish things that we now learn about. And speaking, of course, is a more fundamental form of communication. If you look at children, if you have children, when do they start speaking as opposed to when do they start writing and reading? And even children can tell stories from a young age. I have a little girl she just turned 3, and when she was 2, she came in one day and she started talking about a window width. We don't even know where this name came from, but it was an imaginary friend. She told all kinds of stories about what she and a window width were doing and where a window width was. And I was on a business trip in Malaysia, and I got pictures and videos of her sitting at the table with another place set with food on it for a friend, and she tells all these stories, and I don't know how she came up with this, but children tell stories, and we're all storytellers really from the time we're young. So people naturally respond to this because this is something our brains are kind of wired to do. But even beyond that type of science, if you get to fundamental truth, which is true science, who was the greatest teacher that ever lived? Say? And how did he teach? Yeah, the greatest stories ever used to teach are still used today. The parables the Savior taught teach the most important lessons that are ever going to be taught in this world. They can change our lives. They bring us salvation. The gospel was taught through stories. And as the Savior taught these simple principles, people understood the principles of the gospel through these stories. And of course, we use the same parables today, 2,000 years later, to share the gospel with others. So in anything we do, I guess, if we look to the Savior's example, we're going to follow the right path. And I think in teaching, that was one of the things that inspired me, especially as I became a seminary teacher. I found the more I went to the scriptures, the more I saw that the examples of the Savior, I realized that these timeless, simple stories were the way to help people understand the concepts of the gospel. So how do we do this? Podcasts. When I was in my teacher training, you probably can all think back to when you were in that. My teacher was a person who I knew by email address and on discussion boards, and he actually had a picture, but that was it. It was just a person who had a name and a little picture, and that was it. And then he sent out a podcast. He said, listen to this. Wow, he has a voice. And I actually learned something. He told a story, and I remember thinking it was more personal now. And it was my first real experience as an online student, I guess, in being trained as a teacher to incorporate podcasts. So I start my class most semesters with a couple of podcasts I put together about a really cool experience I had as a part of a consulting team when I was in MBA school. And my class involves a really difficult consulting project that a lot of students whine about, and they hear about it. In fact, I had people emailing me before, hey, I heard your class has this. Does it still have that? Because I don't want to take it if it has that. And I say, yes, it still has it. It'll be the best part of the class if you allow yourself. And I tell this story because it shows that I was in a really similar situation, kind of a vague, murky objective, and we were given things to do that we really didn't know how to do, and it looked like success was going to be near to impossible, and we actually were successful. And so I use a podcast to share that, and there are other ways to do it too, but that's one example of that. In fact, anybody's ever been to the Tuacahn Theater in St. George, it's still there because of the little consulting project I did with some students at BYU. It was ready to close until we helped them change the way they ran. Screencast, this is probably my favorite. When I first got into these training classes and I saw my first James Screencast, I was really excited, and I started using Snagit, which is a little better. I took it to work and shared it at Intel and got awards for it, and I have VPs now that contact me, hey, show me how you put that thing together and how you shared that. How did you record your voice with that stuff on the screen? We changed the way we talk about all of our training at Intel as my part of the company by using Snagit. You're like, where did you learn that? That's some stuff I realized I worked. So I didn't tell them it was BYU-Idaho who was helping me better. But that's what's happening. So screencasts are great. I use them to introduce topics almost every lesson. I put together, I think, 15 to 20 of these now. A lot of my instructors in my teaching group do this and do it really effectively. So as I do in course visits, I can go and watch theirs. Yeah, there's a lot of great stuff out there. Screencasts are powerful. Trivia questions. Anybody know what Tiani 2 is? None of my students do either. Tiani 2 is the world's fastest supercomputer, and I use that in one of my lessons talking about technology and innovation and disruptive technologies. And it turns out that some of the products I worked on as part of my job went into building the fastest supercomputer in the world. And Tiani 2 is the name of it. So I start out with that and just say, hey, does anybody know? It gets their attention. Well, what is it? Now they're curious, and I can want to tell the story behind it. So it's a good way to lead people in to wanting to understand what's coming in the story. I start a lot of them with pictures, and this is one that I actually pulled right out of the screen of one of my lessons. And this is a picture, you probably can't see it. It's a rusted out, broken down old 67 Camaro over here, and it's a fully restored, beautiful, much better than when it was new over here. This is a car that I restored with some help from my father, and my son worked with me on it. and it's a little hobby I have. But I show this and I ask a couple of questions, or I just show a picture. What is this? And people start asking questions. They know there's a story behind that, and they want to know what that story is. What kind of car is that? And who did that, and how did you do that? And so it's another way to lead people, and it's just a simple picture you can get to get people's attention. Who I am stories. A great way to introduce yourself, a great way to introduce a person that represents a principal or teaches a principal. Anybody know who the greatest home teacher in the history of the church is? There really is one.
I was going to say me.
You? Wow. You might be the second best. I'm not sure you're the best. I believe the best home teacher in the history of the church is a man named Herman Van Brock. Herman Van Brock I learned about from my family history research. He was a Dutch immigrant, came to Ogden in the late 1890s, and he didn't miss a visit any month for 53 years. And you say, well, there's probably other people who have done that. Well, how many of them visited between 35 and 50 families every month for 53 years? That's what he did. So I use that as I'm teaching students about, they're all buried with all the stuff going on, and I have all these responsibilities. I'm too busy to do my homework. I'm too busy to complete that assignment and attend my meetings. And I have a family and a job, and I have a church calling, and I have all these other classes. Say, well, what are you, you're home teaching? Well, look what Herman Van Brock did. So it's a great who am I story. Now they know about this Dutchman who died 70 years ago and how he can teach the principle. And I had a student, in fact, respond to me a couple weeks ago when I sent that out, and he said, that's exactly what I needed in my life right now. That was the message I needed to hear. So they can be very helpful. Timely topics. Anybody teaching business these days hears about Steve Jobs and Apple from their students because everybody likes to talk about Steve Jobs and Apple. Years ago, when I was first starting at Intel, we were building a product for Apple, and Steve Jobs was running Apple, and Andy Grove was running Intel, and Grove was one of Steve Jobs' idols. Grove was a brilliant business mind. And he sent an email over to Grove and said, hey, you're building this product for me, you're constrained, I can't get as much as I need, go fix it. So Grove sends it off to a vice president, hey, go get this fixed. This is for Steve Jobs. And guess who they sent it to next? And it happened to be my job to go get this fixed. So I got a hold of the factory and said, hey, whatever you do, I'm cashing all my favors, get this fixed. And so I had this little personal brush with Steve Jobs, and able to send it back and say, yeah, got your stuff, it's all taken care of, and ready to go. And my students were like, wow, he worked with Steve Jobs. I didn't really work with Steve Jobs, but I did fix something for him once in many years. And if you are able to bring something like that that's timely, that they're thinking about, they're interested in, now you've got some attention from your students, and they may listen to the other stuff you talk about. Written stories. I put that later in the list. If you're going to use written stories, make them short and make them, really to the point and highly interesting. I put some really great stories out that were long, and nobody ever bothered to finish reading them, I think, let alone comment on them. But they can be effective. And know your audience, though. Especially younger students seem to have a hard time with that. Cliffhangers. A lot of us teach in business case studies. Some of these case studies have amazing outcomes, really surprising outcomes. And we spend a whole week analyzing them. The students are making their own guesses about what the company should do or making recommendations and proposals. And we'll hold that till the end and say, well, what happened? And drop the surprise on them at the end. And that can be a really effective way, again, to keep them engaged throughout a week to know, can you figure out where this is going? And there's a classic example of a cliffhanger. Values and action stories. A lot of times, especially at BYU-Idaho, we're talking about things like teach one another and the spirit of bricks and these things. I had a student in my class a few years back named Travis, who was just a brilliant young man and one of the best students I ever had because of the way he taught other students. And I didn't know what he was doing until somebody said to me, hey, I want you to know what Travis is going to do in our group. And he talked about how he had personally helped him and taken time out of his schedule to help this other student learn things. And he said he doesn't get enough credit, and Travis never would have told me this. So I send out this email every time with some names changed to my students to just say, hey, this is what it looks like to teach one another. This is what we're talking about at being a student in this class and how it's effective. It really helps the students see better themselves in that mindset. And then finally, vision stories. Best example of vision story I've heard in a long time was yesterday from President Gilbert. He got up and he talked about how he got to Rexburg, and how President Clark got to Rexburg, and how Ryrie stayed in Rexburg when he was thinking about leaving. And how long did it take him to tell those stories? 5 minutes? And did that help you understand the vision of this university and the vision the brethren have for this university? One of the best explanations I've ever heard about what this place is all about, why we're doing what we're doing, came in that little story that he shared. And if there's anything I want to take out of that talk and tell somebody else who's curious about why this place is unique, you'll listen to that and ask me if you don't understand it. I think you would. So, really good example of a vision story, showing a vision through a simple story. So some tips about methods. First-person stories are always the most powerful. If you have your own stories, they're going to be much more credible and more effective. Also, stories about a person who is like our students can also be extremely effective. A couple of years ago, I had a student in my class who was really struggling. Well, look at this. His work was dropping off. All of a sudden, I contacted him and said, hey, what's going on, or something I can help with? He said, yeah, I'm actually dealing with some problems here. As we talked more about it, it was clear he was going through some difficult things, something that I had been through myself many years ago. And I said, hey, I have some insights into this. And I shared my own experience with him. And he later sent me back an email. He said, what you told me is almost word for word what was in my patriarchal blessing. It was something I had been thinking about. And then he told me he grew up in an inactive home. His parents were active in the church. He said, I got here at BYU-Idaho just because of some friends. But I never considered going on a mission. I'm 25. I'm graduating from college this semester. And I think I need to go on a mission. So he put in his papers and he left on a mission after he graduated. And I get emails from him every once in a while. And it all happened because I shared that story, my personal story that was similar to his situation. So take advantage of those opportunities. And also, if you want a really great result on an assignment, ask your students to use stories about themselves. Share a story about something that's happened in their life, and you're going to learn new things about your students. And really, the studies in some of these books I've talked about show this is one of the best ways to get knowledge from people about their experiences, have them tell a story about it, or share their story. And then finally, document and archive your stories. This is maybe the most important takeaway, maybe the hardest lesson it took me to learn how to do this the right way. And we use this term garbage in, garbage out. We store a lot of data, and it's the same with stories. It doesn't matter how well you present a story, how well you place it in your class. It's not a good story. It's not going to work. And my method is really simple. I used to put these on paper, I used to type them up, and I got to find the word, and I just punch them in my phone. The subject line on an email will say story in all caps. I'll put in a few notes, maybe a few other notes in the body, send it to myself. It goes into a folder of stories. I'm sitting in church and someone says, hey, you know, go teach a lesson about this. I go into my story folder, type in the topic. There I got 5 options right there. I've got hundreds of these I've archived now. And it's a really simple way, and it's always easy to access, and the phone is always with you. So that's one way you can do this. Elder Irie, great example of this. And this is something that also kind of touched me about missing opportunities to share things. So when he was first married, he talked often about when he was teaching in Stanford and he was starting his family, and they were actually living with his father-in-law in the guest house at that time. His father-in-law had a big property, and in fact, in this story, he said, he's the son-in-law you have to watch out for, right? Because he moves into the father-in-law's house, and he was teaching at Stanford. Anyway, he came home one night. He said, late one night as I came home, I approached the front door of the guest house. My father-in-law appeared out of the darkness carrying a load of pipes. And his father-in-law was a wealthy man, had a big business. And he said, I was stunned to think he was working so late to install a sprinkler system by himself, but he could have had any number of his employees do it for him. So a little insight into his father-in-law, what kind of a man he was. And as I approached the door of the guest house, I heard a voice in my mind, I'm not giving you these experiences only for yourself. Write them down. So what did he do? Rather than go to bed, he went and he wrote a paragraph about this. He also wrote down some things his wife had told him that day when they talked on the phone about their children. And then he said, I wrote in that journal without missing a day for 21 years. Elder Irie is an inspiring man in so many ways, but this really touched me because it seems like, well, he saw his father-in-law doing some work he didn't have to do himself. Well, now he can share this story with people years later about a lesson he learned from his family, from his father-in-law specifically, and how that could be taught and shared. And he said now he's actually had bound published versions of his journal that he shares with his children so they can learn about the insights he had. He raised them and he and his wife prayed about them and tried to help them. So this is not just a way to teach, it's a gospel principle that we should all be following. So in closing, stories are a powerful teaching tool. They can inform, they can teach, they can motivate, and you need to take the time to document your stories and then work them into your course. If you do this, I think you'll find that even in an online course, a lot of great ways to teach through stories.